It's the week of October 15th, 2018, and you're listening to the Missouri GrowingPoint Agronomy podcast. I'm your co-host, Pioneer Field Agronomist Jaime Farmer, and joining me again this week is my counterparts to the east and west, Nick Monnig and Scott Dickey. So, fellas, welcome back to the show. I know we've definitely had a pretty good bout of rain there. My area definitely seeing quite a few inches of rain, so how things looking on each of your guys' respective areas?
We're starting to dry out, Jamie, finally.
We're working on it on my side. Some of our areas had 7 to 10 inches of rain in the last week or week and a half. It's going to take a bit.
And a little bit of snow there over the weekend, so it's going to be interesting to see as we've still got quite a bit of harvest left out there. We have had some areas, some more than others, get into some soybeans here. Quite a bit of yield variability out there. We're seeing swings anywhere from 30 to 90 bushels out there in those soybean fields. A lot of that variability is related directly to amount of rainfall that those fields saw this season, differences in planting date as we look out there across those different environments, as well as differences in maturity. So if we look across the few plots that have come in, some of the early bell ringers for us are in that A-series lineup for us on both the Extend and the Liberty Link side. Seeing some big numbers coming in on P37A56L, P40A47X, P42A96X, and P44A37L. Some of those that are definitely kind of sifting to the top of the pile there as we look at those few early plots coming in. But obviously with the wet weather, the cold weather, there's a lot of things out there in those soybean fields that we're starting to see. The excessive rainfall that we've seen across the area is not going to make things any easier, and also kind of increase some of the potential risks that we'll see from yield loss and some of the quality concerns that we have out there in the field. So we thought with this week, we'd talk a little bit about soybeans, all about soybeans as far as pod splitting, sprouting, some of the quality concerns, and some of the black plants that we're seeing out there. So with that, Nick, I think one of the first things that we're seeing across really Midwest, even from, say Nebraska all the way to Indiana, is a lot of concerns with pod splitting. So what are some of the things that we're seeing out there in the field or potentially could see more of, and some of the reasons behind why this may be a bigger issue this year than it typically is?
Yeah, Jamie, so with pod splitting, or some people call it shattering, that's just when the pods open up before we get into harvest. So a little different than head shattering when we're knocking them off at the reel, but this happens before the combine reaches there. The pods come open, the seeds fall to the ground, which it's a plant's normal mechanism to try to proliferate into the next generation, but it's not something that we want to see with soybeans. There are a few things going on. Some places hit harder than others. Obviously, by maturity, by planting date, those things are going to come into effect just like it is with yield. Some of the early maturity stuff, we may be seeing it do a little bit worse, especially extremely early stuff, just because they've been mature longer. So we might see a little bit more pod splitting there, and probably several things going into this, Jamie, as to why it is happening. But we're seeing poor pod development, and that's caused by the drought this summer. So we got some weakened pod sutures, some thin pod walls going on, and that being caused by the drought. One thing that really impacts that is soil potassium levels, and when we get dry, potassium has to move in through mass diffusion, which means it needs water to get into the root. So if we don't have the water to get it in there, obviously it's going to take in less than what it needs. But if we get into low testing potassium soils, that's a really hard thing for the plant to get enough potassium in those situations. If you think back to this summer, we had a lot of those fields with the yellow margins on the leaves from potassium deficiency when we were in that heavy drought there in July. So we have the low potassium levels causing thinner pod walls, causing weakened sutures within those pods. And then we also, in some places, we had a lot of rain down the stretch in August. Not everybody did, but a lot of places did. That probably made for some bigger seeds because we didn't have all the pod load there. We made bigger seeds to try to make up for it in yield, and then we're starting to imbibe a lot of moisture here at the end. So that's making some really big beans. It's causing those pods to take on more than they can stand. Those sutures are just really weak and popping open. And as we get going through this wet and dry cycle, if we dry out here and then we wet up again, that's going to make for more and more shattering going on.
Good point, Nick. Definitely something that we're going to see out there in the field in some places, and some of our neighbors to the north and west and east of us are seeing as well. One thing, Scott, that we're also seeing in some neighboring states and have the potential to see here would be some of the sprouting in the pods. So Just kind of explain to the listeners a little bit about some of the concern with that and some of the environmental factors that have to take place for us to see that.
Sounds good, Jamie. And part of my area, in particular in northwest Missouri, where we've had some of the heavier rain events with the 7, 8, 9, 10 inches, I don't think the amount of rain is as critical as how many days we were wet consecutively. When you have fields that are at maturity and they're beginning to dry down, and they dry down below 55% moisture, and then they re-wet or imbibe water and increase their moisture levels up to greater than 55% moisture, they are prone to germinating in the pods, and that's something we just don't see hardly ever. I assume it's because we very seldomly get back above 55% grain moisture after maturity sets in, but we're seeing that regularly this year, and it's caused some germination of seeds in the pod.
Good point, Scott. Definitely something that we're seeing in areas to the west of us, and that we would probably also see maybe exasperated where we have some of those thinner pods, and maybe it's a little bit easier because of the drought stress to see some of that seed moisture jump up there above 55%. Is there any management considerations that somebody could do in a situation, whether it's from a shattering standpoint, Nick, or if it's the pod splitting standpoint, as we get back out there in that field? What are some of the things that we can do to kind of minimize that risk?
The best thing we can do in terms of that shatter, that pod splitting going on, is obviously harvest that as quickly as you can. I mean, that's going to reduce the most load of the pods or the seeds falling on the ground. And then you really got to watch it when you harvest it. Make sure you're not shattering a bunch of them at the reel. Really pay attention to how you harvest that field.
Yeah, that's something that I definitely always try to make a point of too, as well, is just kind of watch that reel speed and keep an eye on how much head shattering is occurring, so that way we can minimize as much as we can the amount of loss that we'll see at harvest. One of the other things that we're seeing out there in the field, and we continue to get questions on, are some of the fungal diseases that we're seeing now affecting some of that soybean seed quality. So we talked earlier in episodes there in this summer where we saw Cercospora leaf blight causing some purple seed stain. Mentioned that on the last episode. Some of the other things that we're seeing out there in those soybean pods that's affecting the seed would be some of the frog eye lesions that also infected the seed. So seeing some of that kind of smoky reddish brown coloration where that seed attaches to the pod that was infected by frog eye. And then we're also seeing some issues from diaporthe pod and stem blight. Phomopsis complex can cause some seed decay, some mummified seed. Not necessarily seeing a big difference between different varieties. It's more of an issue when it comes to that seed decay of planting date and maturity and how that lined up to when we got that disease infection and the severity of those diseases. But definitely something to also keep an eye out for is those quality concerns. There are some fields that I know insurance adjusters in Northwest Missouri have taken a look at, and so we just want to make sure that if you've got some of those seed quality concerns, segregate those seeds and keep that grain away from some of the cleaner fields that you have.
Jamie, just a quick question that we get sometimes from guys that have those quality concerns. Your experience, what you've seen in your area, fungicide versus no fungicide, you see any differences?
The big differences there are, I had some observations where we had some high lines and stuff put on aerially, and you can see pretty big difference, particularly on the Cercospora with the purple seed stain, and then also a little bit on that pod and stem blight. Where we had the fungicide out there, it's a pretty clear line versus where you didn't see it. Now, as far as yield differences go, I don't have enough out yet in my area. You think about Chillicothe and some of that area in north central Missouri. We've had a lot of rain there last week, and so we've kind of got to get the water out of the field first and see how big of an issue that's going to be before we can kind of factor in some of those yield differences. But visually, definitely some big differences there on the quality of those seeds.
I'd say yield-wise, just that question that you bring up, there's still a lot of data to come in for us to see. But to your point on the quality, the fungicide definitely seems like it helped make that a healthier plant, even though it probably ran out of residual control and this late season disease came in. It made that a healthier plant and allowed it to ward off some late things like pod and stem blight.
Yeah, and you can find the pod and stem blight in those fields that had a fungicide on it, but it's not necessarily affecting the pods nearly as bad. It's mostly on the stems. And that's where, you've got to have the pods infected pretty significantly to then transfer that to the seed. So I think that's right on point where we're seeing the biggest difference. Scott, speaking a little bit about some of the plant health differences that we see out there, one of the concerns, we always talk about how black some of these combines can look when they get done with corn. What are some of the things that we're going to see with these black plants that guys are already starting to see out there in those soybean fields?
Over the last week, I've had several calls on fields that have been turning black, and when those fields turn black, that's an indicator that saprophytic funguses such as alternaria are setting into the fields. And these saprophytic funguses are funguses that feed on dead material. And so the first question guys always ask is that had an effect on my yield? And in case of these types of diseases, no, they do not affect the yield because they come in after the plants are already mature. And so we see the same thing in corn. Once the plants are mature, they turn black. So cases where you see these black plants, there's nothing to worry about. I think the biggest thing a guy might want to keep in mind is you might want to have a little bit of extra Windex around to keep the windows cleaner, because that's basically the only thing you're going to have an effect on.
Excellent point there, Scott, with the windshields and wanting to keep them clean. Always important to try to stay as safe as we can out there, folks. But, those black fields, just working on the dead tissue out there, so not a huge concern. One of the things that we talked about last podcast was a little bit about wheat planting. I know some of those acres are going to go down now with all this extra moisture that we have. But for those of you that's still going to take the opportunity to go out there and establish a wheat stand, you might want to increase that planting rate for that wheat about 10%, just to be sure that you've got an adequate stand when you come through the winter for next spring. Nick, also some of the things we're thinking about fall as we look ahead here, just kind of give an idea here on some of the topics that we'd like to cover for the next podcast.
I think next time we probably spend a little bit of time hitting on fall anhydrous applications, talking a little bit about Inserv, trying to get through the details on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Something that we've been getting some questions on now with Corteva and some of the products that we're bringing into the portfolio that came from Legacy Dow, some of those Optonite products like Inserv and Instinct. Products that have been around a while, there's a lot of good data on, but still some questions maybe for some of the Pioneer customers that don't have a lot of experience with that. So something that we'll look forward to speaking with you guys next week. So with that, we thank you for your time and we thank you for your business. Nick, it's always important for folks to know where to find us if they can't find us in the field.
They can find the podcast at podcast.pioneer.com, or they can find us on Twitter. I'm at Nick Monnig.
And I'm at the Jaime Farmer.
I'm at Dickey Scott.
And you can also reach out to your local Pioneer sales professional to get signed up for any Walking Your Fields newsletters and other agronomic updates delivered to your inbox. And so with that, again, we thank you for your time and we thank you for your business, and we look forward to speaking with you again.